Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to feed a couple of my worm bins. One of them is already up here on the bench ready to go, and what's on the menu today is a whole bunch of Brussels sprouts. It almost looks like the container is dominated by Brussels sprouts, but if you look carefully down underneath them, there's also a whole bunch of asparagus in here. And on this side, a whole bunch of what I believe are called parsnips. And there might be a little bit of this and that other stuff mixed in, but it's it's a pretty good size amount of food. Hopefully enough to feed two systems. The first of the systems is a red wiggler bin that's now 178 days of age. I'm going by memory now. I didn't bring down any information about these bins, but I believe there's 18 days difference between these two systems. I believe the other one is 160, and I believe this one's 178 days of age. And here again, I'm going on memory, but I believe that this is this system's 16th feeding. And the other red wiggler bin that we're going to feed when we're done with this one is the system that I affectionately consider to be my population of the original worms with which I started this hobby many years ago. Over 5 years now. And wow, they've really done a number on this piece of top covering newspaper. I usually make an attempt to try to keep using these sort of things over and over as many times as I can, until it just becomes impractical to keep trying to do that. And I'm starting to wonder if we might be better off just using this piece of newspaper as bedding beneath the feeding, and maybe coming up with a nice new replacement piece of top covering. The other thing that you're seeing here is a coffee filter, which is meant to indicate to us where we last fed, but I believe that that too is at this point nothing more than just scraps of paper, best used as possibly bedding. So the feeding, indicated to us by the coffee filter, would have been placed right down the middle, and that's where a lot of times you would expect to see the majority of the worms occupying the system. Although it's not a rule, it's also quite common to check the outer edges of the system and also find lots and lots of worms hanging out over there too. I wasn't sure what to expect as far as leftovers, because it's been 2 weeks now since these two systems got checked in on. However, one thing that I fed a lot of during the summer, and we're now in autumn, one thing that was pretty popular around here in the summertime was corn. So corn cobs are something I still see quite a bit of, even though I don't think I've had any corn here at home for weeks and weeks. There's still good amounts of the corn cob in my bins. In fact, I don't even remember the last time I fed corn cob. I think I ran out a while ago. But the corn cobs take the worms a little bit of time to eventually break down, so I think we'll be seeing leftovers of the corn cobs in my systems for a little while longer at least. I was kind of trying to work my way around what we caught a glimpse of a moment ago, which was a orange placed in here. Not during the last feeding, but I believe during the previous feeding. So, like I said earlier, it's been 14 days since the last time we checked in here, and even prior to that, it might have been another couple weeks that it had been placed in here. I can certainly smell the scent of orange, and it still seems like they've not breached the outer skin of this thing. And I usually try to just leave certain things untouched to see how the worms manage with it without my help. And it makes me wonder if I should maybe sort of bend or break that rule a little bit and actually at least pierce the skin on that thing to permit worms to get inside if they wanted to do so. And maybe it's not even so much the worms getting in there. Perhaps it's some of the other microscopic life forms that occupy the system with the worms that would need to get in there prior to the worms to start breaking the contents of that orange down. Because my guess is that if it's not been, I see a hole there, and I'm just wondering if that was just caused by me just now. And it is starting to tear open more and more, so perhaps I should just leave that as being the hole that I had thought about possibly creating. So I'll just write that off as now being pierced and accessible. So I don't know if there's just maybe too much acid, citric acid in that orange to permit the worms to start nibbling away at it. But I believe that in time, you know, it should break down to the point where the worms can totally take advantage of it and eat it up. But it's just one of those things that you never know what to expect. I did limes in one of my systems not too long ago, and there too, after multiple feedings, I still think that I'm sensing the smell of it. Although I didn't see leftovers of it, I was able to smell it. Same way I was able to smell this orange as soon as we arrived. So we'll get around to checking the outer edges of the system. But we're going to plop in today's feeding first, and then we'll start excavating the outer edges to see how things out there look. It does seem to me like there's a good number of worms hanging out here, and it also seems to me like there's a fair bit of moisture in here too, which should make the worms pretty happy. So let's use this piece of newspaper that had been the top covering, as well as the coffee filter that we pulled off. This should make for a pretty good bedding underneath the feeding. And as the veggies that are now frozen, all of them are frozen, as they start to thaw out, I imagine the juices will start to come out of those veggies. Although, you know, when you think about Brussels sprouts or asparagus or parsnips or whatever those white carrots are, I think that's what those are. I don't really see those as really very juicy sort of vegetables, you know. I don't see a lot of fluid coming out of these, but sometimes it's a little deceiving. You can't really even tell until you've actually frozen this stuff and start to observe how it reacts to the thawing process in terms of how much moisture it kicks off. But my guess is that the system doesn't need any moisture anyway, so if any moisture does come out of these veggies, it'll just make this environment even more damp and even more cozy for the worms. It almost makes me wonder if it's necessary to go back with the bubble wrap covering that was on this thing, because the material in this system is quite damp, and I wouldn't want it to go overboard and get too damp and muddy. So I'm just debating on how to cover things up here once we're finished. I think we've pretty much tapped into about half of what was in here, perhaps even more. I think there's a pretty big difference in terms of how many worms occupy these two systems. I think one of the systems only had an estimated 800 some odd worms in it. I'm not sure if it was this one or the other bin with the original worms in it. It might be this one that had what we estimated to be only 800 worms populating it when we first launched the system. But I think over and over, you know, we've looked in here numerous times since it was launched. So yeah, this would be its 17th feeding. And I think that on many occasions we've already kind of come to the determination that there's probably quite a bit more worm population in here than just 800 something worms. So who knows? It's kind of hard to tell. Yeah, this stuff is pretty muddy, and not that it's a big problem now, but it could become a big headache later. So I'm questioning what I want to possibly do here. You know, before I cover up, I guess I've got a little bit of coffee here too we could sprinkle in. The other stuff that I sprinkled in here, this white stuff, was the grit that I usually use, just pulverized eggshells. And, well, you know, I've got a minute or two more to figure out what to do as far as top coverings in this system. I am very tempted to just scrap the use of the bubble wrap, at least for a while, just to see how the system starts to trend as far as moisture levels go. If we were to leave it uncovered for a little while, I think it would do okay, fending for itself, hanging on to its moisture content without too much risk of drying out. Especially if we replace that top covering newspaper with a replacement piece of newspaper. That might actually be enough for a little while to protect this system from drying out too rapidly. And I think just the fact that it's mainly castings at this point would also help the system be pretty resilient to excessive drying. Because these castings, they're really wonderful at retaining their moisture content. So yeah, there was a good number of worms out there hanging out on the outer edge. And I'm wondering how this edge is going to look. When the moisture is this high, I do feel like it's pretty important to aerate the material, sort of till it up and make sure it doesn't start to get too muddy or clumped together. And I don't really feel that. You know, it might seem that way when you look at it in terms of it being sort of, you know, sticky and clumping together, but it does luckily break apart really readily. And I guess it might have something to do with just all these worms cruising through the stuff constantly, kind of making it all full of little channels and kind of aerated naturally just by the worms occupying it. So, you know, I think the one thing we need to address before we decommission a piece of plastic covering that had been on top of a worm bin is just to make sure we don't inadvertently leave any stranded worms on this stuff. And I'm pretty sure I saw at least 1 or 2 worms hanging out on this thing. And not only that, I see, oh, I thought this was a cocoon, but it's really, oh, these are, I think these are, I don't know, millipedes. They kind of curl up and they look like they might be a snail or something. Once they uncurl, I believe that they're little multi-legged insects, possibly millipedes. So here's a worm. I think this might have been the worm I spotted earlier, evading me, not letting me pull it off the plastic. And there might be others. It's just kind of hard to see. I see one here too. They really enjoy squirming around in between the bubbles of the bubble wrap. Some of them are just so tiny though, it's very difficult to see them. So maybe I'll spend a minute or two examining this one more time. Oh, here's another one. Before I just set it aside and consider it as being completely free of worms on it. Because yeah, I think material that's got this degree of moisture to it can probably do with a little bit of drying, and it'll do just fine. Even if the material on the very top surface gets a little bit dry, that's not going to be a problem. Most of this is castings anyway. It's not going to require a whole lot more worm action to continue breaking it down. I mean, here and there is going to be a little bit of material that does still require worm attention, but at some point in the future it'll get blended in and taken care of. For now, I think the system would benefit from being left to air out a little bit. So I'm going to go grab a piece of newspaper with which we can cover up here, and then we'll move on to feeding the other bin. So I went ahead and I just grabbed a piece of newspaper and I tore it in half. Newspaper has sort of a grain, but I believe the grain usually goes the long way. So if I had torn it this direction, it would have torn nicely, but I thought that by being able to tear it against the grain where the fold was, that it might go pretty easily. As you can see, I got a pretty sloppy tear there. So this will be the only coverings that it has for a while. The stuff out here on the edges should get pretty dry. The stuff under the newspaper might be a little bit better protected, and we'll also even put this back on top. Really, this was just attempting to create shade beneath the see-through plastic covering, but since this has been part of the system anyway, we'll just put it back on here. Maybe it'll help things underneath the paper and cardboard remain a little bit more damp and cause a little bit more worm activity. But I think we're ready to move on to the other system, so let's get this out of the way and get the other one fed. Alright, so this is the system that at one point was thought to only be occupied by about 36 worms. I had had a major problem at one point where all of the bins in which my red wigglers that I could track back to my original worm population had kind of crashed and burned, and then I was left with what seemed to be no representation from my original batch of worms that I started this hobby with. But luckily I was able to save a few of them and nurse their population back to health, and they've done great. Now, the one novelty about this system was that, like I said, 2 weeks ago was the last time we checked in on these, but 2 weeks ago was the day that this system actually got brought back into the normal routine of just being fed as an everyday composting bin. Up until that time, it had been running a time-lapse video of an entire cantaloupe that was placed into the middle of the container, and then the camera was filming it for about a month and a half as the worms gradually whittled away the cantaloupe. And then at some point the lighting sort of failed and then I had to just sort of call the time-lapse video quits. But by that time the cantaloupe had more or less been eaten by the worms, and over that month and a half, since I really wanted to not disturb the scene, so that the only thing changing in it was what the worms were gradually doing over time, I'd never added any moisture to the system, and after a whole month and a half of just being open to the air, the material in this system had dried out considerably. So during our last check-in 2 weeks ago, when the system got fed last, I also added a fair bit of moisture. I just kept dousing it with more and more water, and even though it was covered with plastic, I wasn't quite sure what to expect in terms of what the moisture content in here would be next time we come in. But I think it's the reason I went right for the outer edges, because that was where I expected the most dryness to be, the furthest away from where the foods had been placed in. But even out here, it feels quite nice. I don't think there's anything to be concerned about. So I'm just sort of tilling it around, as I like to do sometimes. And even out here, let's take one more look. Lots and lots of beautiful castings piling up. Here too, the moisture level seems pretty decent. Certainly no reason for worry. So that's a relief. Yeah, I was really generous with the water. I just kept pouring it and pouring it and pouring it in. And it seems to have helped. This is kind of the consistency I like, a little bit better than what we saw in the previous bin. Here everything seems very, very granular and flowing, as opposed to having that tendency to clump together due to perhaps a little bit too much moisture. So this is looking pretty good to me as far as moisture goes. So let's see how they're doing as far as the previous feeding and how it's holding up. Lots and lots of worms in here. I think the reason the worms in here are a little bit skinnier than normal is because of the lack of moisture they had for that month and a half while the time-lapse was running. And even here, I believe we're seeing some of the remnants of the cantaloupe that they had been working on during that month and a half. There really was not much of it left at the end. And this, the outer skin of a cantaloupe melon usually does take some time for the worms to break down. It's somewhat tougher material than the juicy insides of the melon. But at some point that stuff too will eventually all get broken down nicely. Yeah, lots of worms in here. They all look so skinny. It's interesting. Some red wigglers you see are so nice and fat. Other ones are skinny, and I think it has a lot to do with how much moisture they've got at their disposal. Alright, well, here we didn't have a top covering of newspaper that we could recycle as bedding beneath the feeding. So I'm thinking we're probably going to have to go grab my supply of prepared bedding off the shelf that we could lay in here beneath the food that we're going to add. This is just more cantaloupe, and it almost looks like they're still working the material off of the skin of it. The very last piece of it that was still getting whittled down by them at the very, very end of the time lapse seemed like it had dried out somewhat and was sort of unable for the worms to get consumed. Unable to get consumed by the worms. It's so weird. It's like, you know what you want to say, but the words just don't come out right. I think you get what I'm saying. Basically, that last little bit of it that was still resting on top had somehow gotten so dry already, even though there was still some meaty melon on the skin, the worms just weren't really able to do much with it anymore because of the moisture content of it being so minimal. And I think that in itself was probably another good reason that the time lapse just sort of ended when it did anyway, because that would have probably just sat there and gone nowhere anyhow. So yeah, I think we're going to go pretty generous down here with the bedding. I've got my little container here of the prepared bedding. We're going to drop in a good bit of it. Ooh. So that's a very good bit. I don't know if we need to go any more than that. Yeah, let's let that be the bedding for today's feeding. And then in can come the yummy foods. I guess now we'll have a better sense of how evenly we distributed the stuff between the two systems. I think in this system there was a starting estimated population of something around 1,250 worms, as opposed to the 800 some odd worms with which we believe we started the other system. When you look around both of these systems, they both seem like they've got quite possibly a number of worms well beyond that estimate. So it's always really tough to tell how many worms you're dealing with, and it's usually just sort of a best guess. All right, so once again, I'm just sprinkling a little bit of this crushed eggshell into the system as grit for them, and well, there wasn't a whole lot in here, so I thought I would just empty it and let them have the last of this supply of coffee. So this will be a pretty nice, generous feeding to sustain them for a little while longer. Yeah, things look pretty good in here. I'm going to, I guess I'm going to just return these little scraps of leftovers we found of the cantaloupe rind and this little piece of corn cob. I guess this system just didn't get as much corn cob as some of my other systems. In other systems, I'm just bumping into this stuff all the time. Here, it seems like there's a pretty limited amount of it. You could see how much the worms really enjoy being on the inside of that stuff. I'm kind of stranding them out here on this little island of material. Everything around them is frozen. But I don't think it's going to stay that way for long. I got a feeling that the material, once it's in the worm bin and covered up with room temperature stuff, just thaws out pretty quickly, so it won't stay frozen for too long. And yeah, the moisture in here is good. So here I could see continuing on with the plastic coverings. If it were summertime when the air is a lot more humid, then I'd worry less about leaving systems uncovered, because there's a much, I think, lesser chance of the material in the system drying out due to evaporation. But now that the colder months are setting in and the heat is turning on regularly in the house, the non-stop heating of the air, I believe, draws a lot of the moisture out of the air, leaving it very dry and causing damp materials like the stuff in your bins to, oops, oh jeez, what did I just do? Just scooped a whole bunch of this stuff out here while I'm gesturing here. All right, I got a little bit of cleaning up to do over here afterwards. But yeah, we sometimes observe drying in the systems due to the climate control in the house, and that's the one thing that worries me, and that's the reason I like covering up with plastic in the winter months. In the summertime, I don't worry so much because climate control is only when I turn the air conditioning on, and I don't do that very often. But in the summertime, in the wintertime, there's really not a lot of avoiding the heat needing to run to keep things comfortable in the house, so I just need to be vigilant, make sure my systems don't dry out too rapidly as a result of that. And here we're going in with a fairly dry piece of material which has the potential, I suppose, to draw some of the moisture out of the underlying material in the bin, but I'm not going to sweat it. I think we're going to be okay with this just the way it is. And we'll just cover back up here with the top covering of plastic bubble wrap. I guess whatever worms are on the plastic over here, we'll have to figure out what to do with all that dry stuff right beneath them. It almost makes me want to come in here with at least a little bit of moisture, just to squirt the newspaper down a little bit, just so it's not so harsh and dry should the worms end up on it. You can already see a number of them have already dropped off the plastic onto the newspaper, so I think a little bit of moisture would be beneficial just in case some of these wormies end up coming off the plastic onto the dry newspaper. So I've also got this top covering of cardboard here too to provide them with a little bit of shade beneath the clear plastic in case they want to hang out there. And I've got some cleaning up to do over there from scooping all that stuff out before, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Cleaning up and putting stuff away is boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.